Hi folks, David Jamieson here, editor of Conter.co.uk. Scotland has a new government. Don't call it a coalition, but the Greens and the SNP have published the draft statement, their policy prospectus and their statement on a joint government over the next few years. I'll get on to some of the policy points in a bit. But I want to start off by saying, do call it a coalition. Now, it's not an accident that so much emphasis is being placed on the idea that this is not a coalition. I assume that this is an important part of how this is being announced, particularly for the Scottish Green Party. What the Scottish Greens want from this situation is the legitimacy and the status and the influence that comes from holding ministerial posts, without the collective responsibility, without being blamed for what the Scottish government does and does not do over the next few years. This is often a debate when coalition governments are made, coalitions of various forms, if we want to use the word coalition to mean various different types of governing agreements between political parties. Is how is this being presented? What does it suggest about the different parties? Because very often, coalitions are very cruel to one or both partners. So we know, for example, from the British experience, that coalition was extremely cruel to the Liberal Democrats, to the point where the Liberal Democrats were almost eradicated as a force in British politics. I mean, they effectively have been. They have a handful of seats, and they've not been able to recover, even as the party's most Europhile party after Brexit. But there are plenty of other examples where coalitions harm the dominant party. A recent example of this will have been Italy, where the Lega Nord, I think it's just called the Lega now, a far-right Italian party, displaced the Five Star Movement, a sort of amorphous populist bloc. And they did that simply by being the more outspoken, coherent element of a coalition government. It's very hard to say who's going to be hurt and who's going to do well out of this coalition. Obviously, both parties want something from it, otherwise they wouldn't have entered into it. So I've already said, I think the Greens want to establish themselves. This is the first time that the Green movement has entered any government in Britain. What do the SNP want from it? I think they want to shield their left flank. I think they don't think there's going to be an independence referendum over the next few years, and they don't want to go into an election in 2026, presumably sans Nicola Sturgeon, with a party, at least nominally to their left, that supports independence and has done so for a good time, to whom they could shed votes. I think that's part of it. I think it's also about COP26. This is obviously like a big moment for Scottish public life. This is a really big international event, and Scotland will be on display and so on. So that's a major consideration, but quite a short-run one, I should think. So that maybe implies that the SNP, the fact that they're willing to bring this about for partly cosmetic reasons, might imply something about how serious the SNP take the Greens as a threat. But all this stuff about it's not a coalition and so on, I mean, whatever. If you've taken ministerial posts, I mean, the argument is that there's not collective responsibility. Actually, there is going to be, a form of collective responsibility over certain areas that have been outlined in a policy paper. The government wouldn't function if people started attacking each other over those fundamental policy commitments. But that's actually the same thing that went on with Tories and Liberal Democrats, and no one didn't, refuse to call that a coalition. The Liberal Democrats had a separate suite of policy areas they could talk about, and so did the Tories, where they could clash with each other. That was written into the deal. Apart from anything else, people forget this now because it was the most rubbish referendum of all time. But there was the AV referendum early in the Westminster coalition that actively set the Tories and Lib Dems directly at each other's throats, and kind of proved, who the bigger dog was in that particular coalition, if anyone had any doubt. But that's a clear example. I mean, there's not going to be something like that coming between the Greens and the SNP. So in that respect, this is more of a coalition. The background to this is the Greens have already co-signed every cuts budget passed by the Scottish government for the last 5 years. Those budgets don't pass without the Greens. So a formal, an ultra informal coalition of sorts already existed. If you're passing budgets, that's the fundamental work of government. If you can be relied upon to do that, then you've already proven that there's a form of collective responsibility, whether you want to call it that or not. What the Greens want to maintain is their right of public criticism. So we're talking here about like a loyal opposition type thing. I don't think the SNP worries about offering that, because I think everyone knows it's empty. It's empty criticism. If you're willing to, you can criticize till the cows come home. If you then co-sign the budget, if you then pass the budget through the House, what's the real weight of your criticism? So I don't really have much time for this ridiculous PR thing about it's not a coalition. We've had this all before. We heard it from the Lib Dems in that coalition. This is a new way of doing politics. The country faces new crises, and so on. It's spin, and it's nothing more really. What the Greens have done, if you could say this is honourable in a way, is they have confirmed the relationship to the SNP that everybody already knew that they had. Everyone knew that the Greens were a sort of addendum party attached to the SNP. That's the kind of ecosystem of Scottish politics. They were already behaving in this way, and now they've created a rather more formal agreement around it. So in that sense, I suppose that we should welcome it. What are the policy proposals? One thing that's interesting is that independence is the top issue. Now, that doesn't necessarily suggest to me this is an independence referendum. After the COVID crisis is the commitment, and I suggest that is an elastic concept. When does the crisis end? This doesn't imply to me that we are hurtling into an independence referendum, sadly, but it does assert what I think should be obvious to everyone. The basis for this government is that the Greens and the SNP are both pro-independence parties, and it's significant that they brought that up as the first policy proposal. So let's set aside any idea that they're doing this just because they want to pass some vaguely progressive or liberal policies in the next few years. The fundamental basis for this is the constitutional question. And that means they need to be held to account on that basis. There needs to be a strategy that people can see. There needs to be a coherent process. There needs to be any signs at all that we're heading forward on this question. Right now, there's nothing. I mean, the official headline independence case, the one belonging to the SNP and the Greens, is a graveyard. There's nothing moving. The case for independence is in tatters after the Leave vote in 2016 and after 2019 when it was confirmed. In tatters. It makes absolutely no sense. So we're a long way from the independence challenge, I'm sorry to say. But, that means that the top priority issue in this agreement is partly fantastical in its basis. And I think that commands our attention, and I think they should be held to account. I think they should be held to account on all of these agreements, but that one is fundamental. At the end of the day, this government only exists because it supports independence. It's that simple. And, I know that a lot of people, it would be easy to be bored by the national question at this point, but I think we can afford to be bored, because that's the fundamental character of our democracy. Centrist forces like the SNP and centre-left forces like the Greens are not doing particularly well all over Europe. The reason why Scotland has been the standout case for the last few years, in any case, is because of the national question. It's really that simple. People see there being a meaningful strategic avenue within politics. And I think, we have to take that seriously and hold this government to account. Other matters in the policy prospectus, I can't cover it all, obviously, but a couple more with significance. I should say that independence case is now, it says in the document, both the Greens and the SNP, it's independence in Europe, and they will be proposing that, and that's in the coalition agreement. So, we knew that anyway, but it's now the policy of the government, a government consisting of two parties. It somewhat laughably says, besides that, both parties retain the right to argue for their version of independence. Sorry, but once you've agreed that it's independence in Europe, you have substantially agreed on all the big questions pertaining to independence. And the European Union is something which would obviously hem in Scottish sovereignty, economic strategy, etc., to a very considerable extent. So the Greens' case for independence and the SNP's case for independence at this point are extremely similar. Now, a couple of other policy issues which I think are important. First of all, on rent controls. So it announces rent controls, national rent controls, to be implemented by 2025. The first thing to say about this is that it's a victory for living rent above all, the Scottish Tenants Union, and for other forces fighting for reform in the rental sector in particular in Scotland. We are here because of their organising efforts, because of their lobbying efforts, because of their activity, and not because of the government. I think we need to assert that straightforwardly. I don't know if anyone would disagree with that. And we're lucky that we have a force which is independent of the political process, which can continue to pursue this. Because the fact that it's in 2025 obviously implies that the SNP, I assume it's coming from their end, the SNP do not intend to make good on this promise. If they did, it wouldn't be in 2025. They want the clock to run out on this. This is what the SNP often does, by the way, with some of its more radical sounding commitments. They hold it right to the end of the parliament, by which point something always happens that means that we can't do it in this parliament, whether that's Brexit or whether that's the pandemic. And we live in a time of stuff happening. There's always going to be a reason why they just can't do it. They can't squeeze it in this period. So obviously that's a work in progress. It's right that the Tenants Union and others celebrate this victory. Obviously, they've put this issue to the fore. But really, the fight is still as much on as it ever was. The SNP's plan, in my view, will be to play this out. They are too close to the lobby of powerful landlords to implement this. So that'll be one to watch. Another is the fact that the drugs death crisis doesn't appear in the agreement. Think about how only a few weeks ago this was like the dominant issue for about 48 hours, as it always goes in Scottish politics. The scandal of death from drug addiction, particularly in poorer and working class areas. In the poorest areas, people are 18 times more likely to die from drug abuse. So we went from the traditional wailing and gnashing of teeth to it not even meriting a mention in the coalition agreement. The criticism of many people is going to be that the Greens in particular ignore issues in working class areas. I'm sorry to say that we have proof of this because, as I've already said, they passed cuts budgets that fell on working class communities for 5 years. And the grim reality of this is the Greens don't draw many votes from those areas, right? So if that obviously partly conditions the way they view politics. It's not going to hurt their vote share to do things like this, to ignore issues in working class communities, and to pile more paint onto those communities. The SNP, they can't avoid blame for this either. They've been in charge for the last 14 plus years. They've also managed to evade responsibility for this issue year after year after year. So that's quite a sorry development, let's be honest, in Scottish politics, just how low down that priority is. Now, another issue, of course, is COP26. I mentioned that it's partly a PR effort from the SNP to get this coalition together before COP26. But it really remains to be seen what the Greens can extract from this situation. If there was a time it was going to happen, it would be happening now. To reiterate, the Scottish Government's record on environmental economic policy is dreadful. Their driving policy is to establish a green investment portfolio and sell off Scotland's renewable assets to foreign investors. And we've already seen the disasters created by this policy at the BIFAB yards, the loss of capacity, the loss of skilled work, the demoralizing impact on working class communities of the so-called just transition. And this is a very serious issue, because if the so-called just transition is experienced as a second wave of deindustrialization in Scottish society, acting upon an already extremely weak industrial base, countries already dominated by foreign capital, it will be rejected by working class people, and you just can't build a transition on that basis. So I think, again, a real test for the Greens. If environmentalism is truly the heart of their politics, and a just environmentalism, then they're going to have to make serious headway over the next 5 years, and they should be judged on that as well. So, I mean, I think it's justified to have real skepticism about this deal on many fronts. Those are just my initial thoughts. That's my initial reaction. I've obviously skipped over a ton of stuff. So if you think there's anything else interesting, comment below, share this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll be discussing all this stuff in much more depth on the website, conter.co.uk. So yes, give me your thoughts, and I look forward to speaking to you all again soon.